What really is science? And how can it help us look at the world around us? Where are its limits? What's the value in literature, narrative, or analogy? And how can any lessons help us understand our world? Who's Norman Borlaug? And why is he responsible for saving more lives than anyone else ever? Thank you for tapping into this episode of Bandwidth Coast to Coast. Those questions were some of what was covered in my conversation with today's guest, Dr. Ari Novy. Dr. Novy is a biologist, author, and CEO of the San Diego Botanic Gardens. He's also a very thorough and dynamic thinker who, turns out, like most great educators, is really good at breaking things down to small pieces before finding the interconnectivity of it all. This episode was a very fun conversation to have that covers a lot of ground. It introduced to me a whole new ways of looking at our time. I learned a lot of really fascinating things about the nature of plants that I had no idea about, particularly appreciative of how they're architected now. What is science and what is it good for? And how, given the challenge we're up against in the Anthropocene, that the only inadmissible action is inaction. A really simple framing that's something I'm still thinking a lot about. I don't want to really frame this episode too much, as it starts off running and really doesn't stop throughout. We recorded this outside, so you can hear some pretty lovely birds chirping in the background, but there is occasionally some wind noise. We had microphones, but they failed about halfway through, so what we're listening to is the recorder I had on the table. I did my best to reduce the noise, but there's still a few spots in there. Because of the mic, the episode starts about 2 minutes in, and Ari is briefly defining what the Anthropocene is. All you missed, though, is my first and only question, and it's citing a chapter that Ari wrote in Living in the Anthropocene, Earth in the Age of Humans. The chapter he authored is titled The Earth as a Garden, and my question was, what does it mean to have the whole Earth as our garden? You'll see Ari is only a little bit into his response, so you really didn't miss much. Real quick before the episode starts, if you'd like to find us on your social media platform of choice, sign up for our mailing list to be the first to know about episode drops, know about upcoming guests or opportunities to ask questions and provide suggestions, please visit us at bandwidthpodcast.com. And of course, if you like what you hear, please follow, comment, or subscribe to the pod, however it is that this is getting to your ears. Just after the drums, my conversation with Dr. Ari Novy.
History, one in which, as the name suggests, is dominated by us. That we have become the dominant force on the planet, and that people, or not people, but whoever can observe 10 million years from now, will be able to see that in the geological record, which is a really mind-blowing kind of a thought process. And we were asked to write a chapter, and it was very interesting. They wanted 3 to 4 page late chapters, for an educated lay audience. No citations, no data. They wanted us to talk about, and we were the people doing plants, not botany, not agriculture, but kind of all of it. So it was a sort of daunting task. But the concept came from many years ago. The great ecologist Dan Jansen at the University of Pennsylvania had given a talk, and he actually never published anything with this in it, but he gave a talk where he mentioned that that the Earth is a garden, and what he meant by that, or at least what we think he meant by that, was that we are cultivating to some degree all of the Earth, and all of the plants on the Earth, and so that was a really poetic way of saying that. And so we reached out to Dan before we published this chapter, and we said, look, we're working on this chapter, and the theme of it is essentially what you were talking about all those years ago. Can we use your phrase in the title, and of course we mentioned him in it. So it came from Dan, and he was very gracious and said, of course, and we said, did you ever publish anywhere that we could cite? He's like, I don't think I did, and of course he's very accomplished and published tons, So it's really just the simple thing, right? I mean, we are gardening the Earth. If you look at what the Earth is, first of all, in terms of living mass, plants are by far the vast majority of what is on the planet. I remember when I grew up, I don't know why, I thought like, if whatever organism weighed the most, if you were able to aggregate all of that like organism, I always thought it was like ants or some kind of an insect. But
yeah, I did too.
It's plants. I mean, it's not even close. All arthropods, are like way less than 1/5 or 1/10 of what all plants are.
Huh.
And so plants are just by far, what's going on. The single most common compounds on, organic compounds on the earth are all either in plants or produced by plants. So plants really determine our kind of biosphere and the building blocks of life more so than anything else. Obviously, in the terrestrial environment, plants are the thing that are taking energy from the sun and converting it into chemical energy, which is the basis for the entire food web. If you take a kind of large view of plants, including in the ocean, where photosynthetic algae and other photosynthetic organisms, if you kind of say, okay, they're kind of plants too, which, fair enough, then it's true in the ocean as well. So plants are a really, really big deal. And the reality is, if you're going to accept the premise that human beings in the Anthropocene are influencing the entire biosphere, and I do think I accept that premise. I think the evidence that's presented by the scientists who push that forward is very, very sound. I think there's a lot we don't know, but I think in very broad strokes, I think that's a very fair way of looking at the world. So if that's true, then we are gardening the planet. Now, some places we garden the planet very purposefully, right? So if we're looking at an urban or suburban environment, in those environments it's very easy. We've removed all the plants that were there for the most part, and we've replaced them with plants that we want there. And even places that are natural looking, like Central Park in New York City, that looks like it's something that was just left to be, and the city was built around it, and then that was protected. But in fact, that's not the case. It was, that is a stylized version of what somebody feels that nature should look like, even though it's naturalistic. And certainly, as we get to more rural environments, agriculture becomes the gardening that we do, right? So we garden, and agriculture, including rangeland, is about 30% of the terrestrial surface of the earth. So for and urban lands are maybe somewhere between 2 and 4% of the surface of the earth. So between agriculture and our urban and suburban spaces, where we practice what we would think of as regular gardening, landscaping, vegetable growing, extensive agriculture, and rangelands. And why I include rangelands in agriculture is because we absolutely manage the vegetation on those rangelands, sometimes very, very intensively, for the forage quality, the food nutritional quality for the grazing animals that are on them. So right off the bat, now you've got just over a third of the entire surface of the earth that we are actively managing. And then you bring in the Anthropocene component of that, and you go, well, you know what, the rest of it, we're actually managing too, whether we're aware of it or not. I mean, if we're now influencing the atmosphere and climatic conditions to the point where that is pushing the ecology of forests that we don't even go to. We have deposition from acid rains and pollution and all kinds of other things.
Glyphosates.
Yep. So that glyphosate, talking about agricultural chemicals.
Yep.
It's a little bit of a different story, but yes.
It's still in the atmosphere, as far as like a whiskey. Still, it has a similar effect. But they're seeing it in the north.
You can measure it, but if we're talking about things that are really actually impacting, like moving the ecosystem, so the
first order effects.
Yes, exactly. So I mean, already with just first order effects, with the amount of sulfur we put out into the air from burning fossil fuels and things like that, sulfur is a limiting environment, a limiting element in a lot of different ecosystems, and so we're adding sulfur all over the place, and that changes things. It changes the fertility of the soil. Sometimes, in some cases, acid rain and things like that changes pH, as well as metals that are available. These things change weathering patterns of the bedrock, and the bedrock contain the minerals naturally, and how they weather determines in what forms and how much they get out in ways that are available to the biota and all that things like that. So there are all these things that are happening, and some of them are very local. So certain kinds of things that we do sort of stay where they are, and other things that we do, the traditional non-point source pollutions that we talk about, they spread, right? And of course, the most spreading thing that we can think of as an example is carbon dioxide. It doesn't matter where you produce carbon dioxide on the planet; it mixes in the atmosphere, and that it affects global warming everywhere. Of course, you have things like heavy metals, which, when we release them into the environment, tend to stay more or less where they are in many conditions, but have significant impacts where they are. And then there's, of course, everything in between. So we wrote the article, trying to in very few words and with very little technical language, explain that this is the case, that we are in fact gardening the planet, and that we are gardeners, and then without kind of coming right out and saying, we are doing it, and therefore we better act like it. Sort of beginning to hint at that, but also trying to be optimistic and not just pessimistic about the whole thing. I do not believe that, in sort of the I myself am a little bit of a techno-optimist at times and in my best moments, and so just because we have all this control and power does not necessarily mean we are destined to be on a path of destruction. I think that, like all great transformations of human technology, we kind of do tend to let the genie out of the bottle a little bit, right? And it happens, we have all these revolutions associated with technology in human history, whether it's the printing press or gunpowder or, whatever's going on. And things do get a little out of control for a little while, but in many cases, humanity does learn how to check itself and come back from the brink in these areas. So the hope, of course, is that humanity will recognize how strong its impact is, how many technologies and how complex it is that we're leveraging all these technologies all over the place, not just uncritically think and go, well, all this technology is bad and we're creating too complex of a world and we have to just sort of, push ourselves back into the Stone Age. I'm very much an anti-Luddite. But that we have to be thoughtful. We have to let science guide us in terms of how the physical world functions. But that science by itself is I always think about science as a shallow epistemology, right? It doesn't really tell us anything deep about our own meaning or existence. That's not what science was designed to do as a language. And so we have to lean on other areas. So the article doesn't quite go that far, but it really sets the stage to help the layperson understand that the Earth is being heavily influenced by human beings. A lot of that is very purposeful and very, we know what that looks like. People know what farms look like in their mind. They have a vision of some kind of a farm. They have a vision of what it means to manage vegetation at their house or in their city or their town, and that these are big impacts and they mean a lot, and that we have to do things in order to manage those resources better.
I like that a lot. Yeah, I like that. Thank you for framing the Anthropocene that way too. That's great. There's a lot of thought that you sparked in with me there. I definitely think so. This is the second time, and I will look this up and post this. But I think it was Rousseau, and I think it was one of his second or third discourses. But he essentially said that technology will always outpace our morality. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. I think, if it's a new form of ideas, like we've seen that, like the turn of the 1900s of what ideas can do as far as a revolutionary idea or a really novel idea, or anything from really any point in time. Agriculture has a lot of examples, and the ones that are most ruminating in my mind of like how revolutionary, petrochemicals were and putting in there, and now we're starting to understand the effects of that. But what's there's a lot in there that I never heard before. Like, I didn't thought about the erosion of natural minerals probably causing some immediate effects from, any number of things. But I really like, one of the things I kind of want to ask you on is, would you say that your view on the Anthropocene is one where we should accept the fact that most nearly every square inch of the Earth is impacted by Homo sapiens, and that by doing that, we should try to recognize it in a way of building it in a more symbiotic way, I suppose, or I don't know what the right word would be for that, but to recognize it and try to cultivate everything as if it was in the sense, like you said, as a garden, and that and then I want to extend out of that to ask you a question. Would you say that science, because I want to ask you about that, your point about science, is that science is like almost as if it's really a really good ruler, and it tells you how long something is, it maybe can tell you how something functions, it can tell you the trajectory of something, but it doesn't really do a good job of telling you why or what or how, other than what you keep doing by using another measuring stick of some sort or another. Was that about right, what you were meaning by that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that, yes, I mean, science is an artificial construct. I mean, science is itself, people get confused, right? So when we talk about science, I think when people say in the vernacular science, when they say, oh, people are doing science, scientists are doing science, science tells us X, Y, or Z, what they really mean is the human endeavor of this activity that utilizes what we call the scientific method or empirical thinking to tell us information about the natural world. That's what they mean. It's a shorthand for a human-created system of systematizing knowledge and testing that knowledge and determining whether or not that knowledge is universal from the sense of physical reality or is not. That is fundamentally what science is when we say that. And that's different from if instead somebody says science meaning the act of being or scientific being. So and I think that's one of these areas where just we always need to kind of help ourselves with the terminology to make sure we're talking about the same thing. So if somebody's using science as shorthand for the nature of the universe,
right.
that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the process that started in the Enlightenment, this very relatively recent process in human thought that creates this scientific process, which has been designed to tell us what physical realities are in fact the subject to universal truth and law versus which ones are not.
Right.
And it's it's an incredibly powerful tool, right? Fundamentally, I think it's a language. It's a tool, just like spoken language or musical languages.
Mathematics in general.
Mathematics is a language, right? Right. Mathematics is a language which describes. Mathematics doesn't even have to describe the real universe. Mathematics can describe anything.
And I would posit is mathematics even a discovery or an invention, right?
Mathematics is clearly an invention.
Right.
I don't think there's even a.
Well, I mean, 1 + 1 does equal 2, right? That's a universal truth. You have one thing, you have two things. Well, I suppose on which dimension you want to choose.
Absolutely,
it,
and
right?
I love that. There's been a meme running around the internet for the last couple of months about they did the 2 + 2 = 4 thing, right? If you're adding 4 squares together, and you put them all so that they fit, with the with a vertex in the center, you make 5 squares. So with the geometry of squares, when you add 2 + 2 squares together, it in fact does equal 5. In fact, that very simple geometric proof there shows that what 2 + 2 = 4 or 2 + 2 = 5 is not a nonsense statement or an iconoclastic statement. It's a contextual statement that sometimes 2 + 2 = 4, sometimes 2 + 2 = 5.
Right.
And it's just a reminder that whenever, again, mathematics is an attempt to figure out the rules, but it's an imperfect attempt, right? And we know this from Gödel or whatever famous mathematicians have talked about that, right? And of course, this goes back to Aristotle and before,
yes,
right? So I think a lot of times we kind of get ourselves tied up in knots because using Aristotelian language, are we talking about the form, or an Aristotelian form, the idea of something that's perfect that maybe is attainable in our language, or are we talking about something a bit more concrete?
Reality.
Exactly. So I think it's important to recognize some mathematicians are in fact in a completely mathematical space, where they don't need to have reality involved in what they're doing, and there's a lot we can learn from that, and that's great. But that's important. Other mathematicians, like economists, are fully applied, and of course many people are somewhere in the middle. And I think sciences are quite similar. And one of the hard things for the public is that every different scientific disciplines, and especially if we allow in the social sciences, they're using math. I mean, science is the language of science, which of course science is a language by itself. But one of the more important languages of science is math, and mostly statistical mathematics. We often are talking about two different things. So, and each discipline of the sciences is also a little bit different. And there's all this human jockeying and ego that kind of like makes that messy. And so, just as a personal anecdote on that topic, when I sort of ran from the sciences when I was younger. I did not want to be a scientist, and part of it was because I had bought into some idea that somebody taught me when I was in high school that there were sort of two kinds of sciences. There were discovering sciences, science that found out new things about reality, and there were descriptive sciences. And biology was generally in the descriptive sciences, and it was sort of looked down upon a little bit, like that it didn't take much human brain power, or it wasn't that interesting to study, to catalog, how an insect works or a plant works or how it's put together. That's a very base kind of a thing. But like doing theoretical physics or something like that was a very high-minded form of science, and that turned me off, and so I abandoned the sciences, and I got an undergraduate degree in literature and history, and then it was a love of horticulture for me that brought me back into the sciences, and then really looking at the sciences as a tool to accomplish wise, management of the planted landscape. Is a very, very important tool, because I used to ask questions like, well, why is this plant diseased and that plant is not diseased? Why does this plant live here where the other plant doesn't live there? And it's very pragmatic kind of stuff. I want to plant this plant, but it's not doing well in this spot. And it's like, well, it's got too much water. It's got not enough water. It's getting a disease. It's got a nutrient imbalance. It's not the right soil pH. It's like shade. There's full sun. I mean, the more you start to interrogate and investigate those questions, you start to get into sciencey kind of stuff, and so for me, science has always been a very useful thing, and I've never held science up as this, again, like I said earlier, to me, science is a very shallow epistemology. If you're going to try to build a set of values for how to live life only off of science, I think you're going to end up with a very shallow and unsatisfying way of looking at things, which is probably why people like Richard Dawkins are very unpopular, to everybody except for scientists, and even most scientists don't even love it, right? So this gets to the fact that we all talk past each other. Things are very complicated nowadays. We have access to more knowledge than we ever have had. We have all of this technology that's expanding our access to knowledge, right? So I don't have to store a lot of knowledge in my brain anymore. I can look up Boyle's law very quickly on my phone. So why am I going to try to memorize it? Mm-hmm. Same thing with I might have memorized the stuff I use a lot, but if I haven't looked at the equations for relativity or for Mendelian inheritance or whatever it is, I know they're out there. I can go grab them, and if I can do the math, I can do the math, right? So. We have so much going on. We have such an ability to have conversations with other human beings that are really cross vast, oceans of human knowledge that we ourselves did not generate. Right? We're able to draw on the cumulative knowledge of so many people, developing so much knowledge over so much time, that it means it's hard to communicate, and we probably need to spend more time discussing shared values and shared assumptions in order to get to the point where we can have really useful conversations about really complicated topics. And I think, getting back to our earlier conversation, where technology, sort of outstrips our ability to, control or think about it, right? Mm-hmm. I think in some ways that's exactly what's happening with our own language. Our ability to communicate. The technology has increased the speed with which we can communicate and the distances across which we can communicate and the scales at which we can communicate. But we have not yet developed the ways of harnessing that and doing it really in a productive way. And we're seeing that, this is not, of course, limited to sciences. We're seeing that in politics and, every area where knowledge intensity is important. And we have to learn that. And that happened. You talked about agricultural technology, which I love talking about, but in terms of communications technologies, after the invention of the printing press, with Gutenberg, there was a period where, before that, the canonized knowledge existed in libraries and these handwritten texts, and they was very well controlled. People didn't fight, as much about what was valid knowledge and what was invalid knowledge. Now, they may have had knowledge that they considered valid that today we wouldn't, but those fights weren't there so much, right? As soon as the printing press came, everything's a double-edged sword. So you had this ability to democratize good knowledge. So the great books that only a small number of people had access to, now many people could have access to it, but also really crappy knowledge could also be spread really easily, mm-hmm. right? So everybody wasn't just printing tomes of great knowledge; they were printing lots of pamphlets, and advertising, and all the and snake oil sales proliferated, right? So, and that's what happens. And it took time to kind of understand. We built new systems. Libraries changed. We built public universities. We built all kinds of different things that would help us as a society better navigate the world with the printed material being available. And fundamentally, I think we're now trying to navigate a world in which digital information travels differently and faster. And we have to catch up, with how to do that. And that's exacerbated by the fact that it's not just the communications that's changing, but in fact the technologies in which we use to manipulate our physical world and things like agriculture.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's I think the communications aspect, to your point, is a good way of kind of reflecting back the broader time that we're in, right? Like, there's an overall gluttony of information, but there's also an overall gluttony of really anything, right? Like, all sciences are really exploding in what they're able to have access to and do. And I mean, you see individuals like, how long ago was the idea of like kind of a Batman billionaire that's able to make a rocket company be something that was like out of the norm, right? Now, I mean, I could think of 3 people off the top of my head that are doing that, right? Like the amount of what we have available to us is kind of reaching a really interesting level. And I think to your point, yeah, definitely we're having a hard time of catching up to it. There's more information in the opening essay of this. I say there's more information at our fingertips, but that just makes it harder to find anything.
Right, we have to learn how to navigate that.
Right.
And you know, I think, you know, I'm not enough of a scholar of history, but it feels like it's true to say that, you know, technology and information explosions happen periodically, and they always overwhelm and communicate. And sometimes they happen when cultures clash for the first time, so new information comes in, not because it's new information, but because it's new to one particular, you know, group or culture, and that's a very painful and awful process, for at least for some people. And
most of history, I would even say that's the case of that. Yeah.
And then it also happens when there are, you know, new technological innovations, and of every kind. And unfortunately, you know, writing is an important form of technology, and writing has been available only to a small, you know, segment of society until very, very recently. And so we don't know that much about what was really going on, you know, more than a few hundred or thousand years ago. You know, we always talk about, most people when they talk about human history, they mean at maximum a 10,000 year history, but more practically probably only about 2,000 to 3,000 years of what we really have any significant written record of. But, you know, biologically, humans have a, you know, over 100,000 year history, and maybe quite a bit longer, depending on how we want to think of what humanity means. And so we're always dealing with this, you know, it's funny how we can talk on the one hand about being overwhelmed by information, but on the other hand be like, well, we know almost nothing.
Yes. Yes.
And so again, I think it comes back to not so much the raw numbers or even the relative numbers, but our ability to handle the kind of information and deal with it and order it and communicate it and then apply it to the most significant, you know, challenges that we're facing.
Yeah, no, I love all of that. Yeah, no, I'm a big fan of Socrates, and I love his answer to, you know, what is wisdom, and all I know is that I know nothing. And I think that that's definitely true. Like, I mean, we can go back to math and physics, right? Like, I was teasing a little bit about, you know, 1 + 1 = 2. I mean, but no state actually does exist, because it always exists in multiple states, and it really only exists in the dimension in which you're using a ruler to see if it exists, right? And then at that point, it's only true if you exist to stop asking, why is that true? So, I mean, all of these things are kind of in a really interesting point. And I think what's interesting with your Gutenberg printing press kind of analogy is that nowadays we have twofold, right? It's not only do we have access that anybody can see whatever it is out there, but anyone can speak of anything that's out there, which in really any other epoch that I can at least recall in what we're talking, it wasn't usually that case, right? Like, just the breaking of being able to have access to knowledge led to the Reformation and the Renaissance that all kind of fell.
And it's interesting. So my undergraduate degree happens to be in Italian literature, and there were
no wonder we're getting along.
Why do you have a literature degree?
Yeah, no, I'm in tech, but I majored in politics and English. So yeah. So
the Italians, you know, were especially in sort of post-World War period, Italian intelligentsia. You know, Italy was very torn in World War II. I mean, you know, it was not everyone loved Mussolini. Not everybody was thrilled that Italy was a fascist state. It was, you know, very, very, very broken. And Italy had only come together as a country in the late 1900s anyway.
Which is something I think people take for granted. Just like hit on that again. Like, it was a lot of different groups of kingdoms almost, right? Different states that all came together, and then Mussolini kind of ratcheted up a little nationalistic rhetoric, and not everybody was happy about it. I'm grossly simplifying.
Right, exactly. It was certainly not a unified country, just as we are not in a unified country.
Right.
And of course, we tend to anthropomorphize, you know, sovereign states, and some states are very much, you know, more aligned than others.
But those are the exceptions.
Those are the exceptions.
Like Japan, you can definitely point to Japan being both a nation and a state, but that is a rare thing.
Absolutely. So, but interestingly, the intelligentsia. So Italy had at the same time a very strong history and activity in communist, you know, literature and scholarship and thought, as well as in fascist and capitalist and, you know, those kinds of things. And I don't mean to put fascist and capitalist together, but just all of those different things.
It's just a fault line you're showing, and it's really as if just kind of how the Alps is a fault line, and, you know, Italy is an outstretch from that, is really how it was idea-wise between Spain and Russia.
Absolutely. But the point I want to get to is that many of the leftist thinkers in Italy, and going back to writings even in the 50s and 60s, as a reaction to fascism and the fact that it was, controlling of information, right? Fascist states were very they didn't hide it. They had ministries of propaganda, and so did socialist states too. They're just to point out that it's not a left-right thing, but in Italy it happened to be on the right, whereas in the Soviet Union it happened to be on the left. But the Italian left, who was pushing back against the fascist right and their control of information, they actually imagined a society of the future, right? Even well before the technology existed, that they called where information transfer was instantaneous, and sort of like to them that was an extension of like an extreme democratization, and they felt that was going to be a force for tremendous positivity, and in fact that was required, right? Because what they were very concerned with looking at how power structures controlled information, and they thought only by sort of simultaneously making all of information as it happened available everywhere could you overcome the problem of entrenched power being able to control information. That feels very quaint to us today, but nonetheless, so it's I mean the point where technology, so we think of technology as this leading edge, and then we react to it, but it's even more complicated than that. I mean, people are very much thinking about these technologies before they come on. The people started talking about concepts of new media in the 70s and 80s, before the new media was even out there. Some things they were right about, some things they were wrong about. Some of those people ended up being innovators in that space. But it's complicated, and human beings, for whatever reason, I certainly don't know the reason, are really diverse in our thought and our experience. We get a lot right, we get a lot wrong. We're all pretty hubristic and egotistic, especially those of us who seem to want to have conversations with all of society. That's an interesting thing to do, it's kind of all over the place. It's really fascinating.
Yeah, I think human beings are really no different than most other species, only more so.
Maybe.
Right? Like,
maybe.
We have a lot of, I would say this is my own personal musing, but I think the one thing about Homo sapiens that makes us so unique is our adaptability. I know a lot of species can kind of adapt, but the fact that, like I said, only more so, we definitely wrap it up to a different degree. And as, we build and interact with the environment in a way that, once again, is like other species, but only more so, and everything is kind of ramped up, and I think the unique thing about our time is that we can reflect on other things going back, like what you just said, in near full color, right? Like we can look back and read writings and almost kind of have an idea of what it is. But we also, at least I always try to remind myself that we're reflecting back from our own stance, right? Like living in that time and looking around left and right is a lot different than looking from another lens
Absolutely.
back.
And that's a huge societal debate that we have right now is do we evaluate people in the past relative to their own time, or do we evaluate them relative to our time? And that's a really fascinating, values-based question. And I don't think science tells us anything about how to do that. I don't think there's any science that can be leveraged to help you decide how to handle that. That's a different kind of a conversation. And sort of relating plants into this, when you say that, it's a really good point to say that humans are like other species, but more so. From an evolutionary perspective, humans are kind of we're one of the most supremely adaptable species, or I shouldn't say adaptable. Humans leverage behavioral plasticity probably better than any other species, right? And especially compared to plants. So plants are really fascinating in that plants have the largest genomes in the world of all organisms, and they have the records on every possible way you can measure that. The species that has the most chromosomes is a plant. The species that has the largest genome, just in terms of the number of base pairs, right, sort of raw bits of information, is a plant. The most genes is a plant, right? So plants have all these genes, and part of that is that plants don't have what we classically think of in biology as behavior, right? A plant mommy or daddy can't teach its plant child a method that it learned, to forage, which some animals can do, birds, and of course humans can do that. So what plants do is that they really are really complicated sensing machines that sense all kinds of stuff around them in a non-centralized way. They have no central processing unit. They have no brain, right? And so using metabolic signaling, they are constantly evaluating their environment, and then they have tremendous genetic architecture to produce chemicals within them. They're really some of the world's most complicated chemical manufacturers to respond to the changes that are happening around them that they need to deal with in order to survive. And that's a different strategy than behavior. or locomotion, right? So some, think about birds, right? Birds have a window of temperatures that they can handle, and so what do they do to handle them? They migrate. They move, in the warm seasons they move north, in the cool seasons they move south, right? If you're in the northern hemisphere, plants can't do that. They can't migrate. They can migrate over generations, but they can't migrate within one individual. Nor do they have behavior. So human beings, we're pretty weak, right? We can't produce all kinds of crazy defense chemicals in the same way that plants can. We can't tolerate crazy conditions or go dormant like a plant can. Many plants are very happy living full-time outdoors in minus 20 degrees up to 120 degrees, right? A human being, we cannot do that, right? We have to invent movement and clothes and technology and all that kind of stuff. And so there are some interesting differences too, humans and mammals as organisms relative to other more stationary organisms. And plants are fascinating because they're these chemical manufacturers, and they adapt, through sort of survival of the fittest, right? If they do get killed off by something, then the offspring that are able to more cope with that are able to move forward. And plants are also interesting in that because they produce very large numbers of propagules, right? So you think about an oak tree or something like that. An oak tree that lives 300 or 400 years may produce hundreds of thousands of seeds per year. So that's millions of seeds over its lifetime. And those are viable seeds, right? And they're all released out into the environment. And if one out of those millions survives, then that plant has replaced itself, right? That's a stable population. If more, now you're going into larger populations, and there's huge selection pressure. Like what's going on with that one seed that it lived? That it's got a novel genetic combination relative to all the other, all of its other siblings or half siblings, and so plants on that generational scale are really putting a much greater amount of diversity out into the environment than human beings with our paltry, one or two children at a time, So it's interesting to think about those basic biological facts of reproduction and life cycle and life trait history, and how that influences the strategies biologically that organism is going to use to survive.
I've never had that type of understanding like you just so basely put it. Like that, okay, so I'm going to transform what you just said into this way. Like, human beings are almost like as if they're plastic. They're very malleable. You can mold them between generations.
Behaviorally, we're behaviorally
yes, behaviorally plastic. And we're genetically set up to be behaviorally plastic.
Our genetics set up a hardware that's plastic.
There you go, yes.
And so the hardware that is set up by right, if you think about genetics as sort of the base code for writing the human organism, then our genetics direct the formation of our brains and the way our brains process information and control the various parts of our body and physiology. And there's homeostasis and other things in there that are not dependent on your brain. But most of the stuff that we can do to adapt is to survive, at least even within one generation, is based on our ability to be behaviorally plastic,
right?
And to transmit that. And language then becomes, right. So language, you can think of it as an emergent property of the human neurological infrastructure, architecture. That is one of the most amazing tools to affect behavioral plasticity, to communicate what one other human being learned to another one so that they can adopt that behavior, and that we have the physiological ability to do that, the mental ability to do that, and the linguistic ability. Plants have none of those things. The plants have a tremendous chemical diversity, and that's their main way of dealing with challenges in the environment. They can't run away, they can't make a weapon, they can't farm or harvest, and so they can, but they carry all these genes, this huge number of genes that can do stuff for them when they need to, and so they have sensing mechanisms, and it's all done in a decentralized processing unit. There's no centralized processing unit.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I never. Luckily, I have this going. I don't know what just happened, but my other recorder died, so we don't know how to use the microphones anymore.
Okay.
But no, I've never had that type of realization before. Like I like I said, in another life, I was much more literary regularly. And I think one of the most interesting things about really anything is banal. Like really base information or boring things tends to tell you so much more. And I've never thought about, like you said, like humans are genetically, our hardware makes us behaviorally plastic. So like plastic is the the kind of the construct of the glass I'm feeling for Homo sapiens, and then plants are almost like titanium. It's like you're molded into this titanium vessel, and you're incredibly great at whatever it is that has gotten all of the type of evolution to get you there. And if anything needs to change here on out, it's very like you said.
Well, they're chemically plastic.
Chemically, they're okay.
And so they the
behaviorally versus chemically.
Right, and so now there's a group of plant biologists who are trying to push to call that plant behavioral sciences, and they're sort of saying, and there's even a subfield of plant neurology, which I hate because plants don't have neurons, but their point is that modern neurology is really about the biological hardware of processing complex signal information and processing it into something that can be used for the organism's benefit. And if you use that as the definition of neurology rather than the sort of an anatomical definition of arising from a neuron,
or something, right?
That the plants absolutely do that, and they do it in a completely different, decentralized way than organisms with central nervous systems have evolved to do that.
So it's almost as if plants are more akin to an ant colony than they would even to be to other anthropomorphs.
Ant colonies and colonial insects are another. So if you get steeped in evolutionary biology, that's kind of like another one of its own paradigms, and they have evolved. So what are referred to as truly social insects, which are certain bees and ants, and there's one mammal, the naked mole rat, that are like that. They're kind of thought of as their own thing, and they're superorganisms, and they're fascinating because you have, we'll use the classic example are honeybees, right? Honeybees, they have these complicated systems, right? In ants and certain bees, you have caste structures where they're developmentally pushed into specific tasks. Honeybees are interesting because there are very few castes. There's actually only 3 castes. There's the queen bee, there's the drones, which are all the males. So it's not a true caste because that's a gender difference, and then there's the rest of the females, which are just the worker bees, right? And they don't there are roles in the hive, so there's a nurse bee and there's a guard bee and there's foraging bees, but they actually cycle through those roles during their lifespan. And so when bees are first born, they're nurse bees, and then they'll do other jobs, and then their last job, all bees' last job is foraging, and they tend to die. They work themselves to death and they die outside the hive while foraging on their last trip.
Wow.
So none of that's genetically determined, right? But what is interesting is that there's only one female in that hive of tens of thousands of bees that ever produces offspring. So that's different, right? So any genetic changes that might have arisen in any of the worker bees cannot be passed forward. So even though it's not like us, right? So we think of, this is why they call it a superorganism. So humans, we differentiate ourselves into our cell lines. We have what we call germ cell lines and somatic cell lines. And germ cell lines are cells that can give rise to a reproductive propagule unit, right? So in humans, sperm or eggs, or ova, and then so that if there's a genetic change in those cell lines, that could be propagated forward to another generation. But if I have a mutation in a cell in my pinky finger, there's no real way, other than using science, but to have that move forward. Insects are like that, but instead of having that in cell lines, it extends out to the superorganism. So some individuals are germline and other individuals are not. Plants are kind of a whole other paradigm, right? Where one of the interesting things about plants is that plants are kind of like all stem cell, So and this is an oversimplification.
No, you can generalize.
This is an oversimplification, but for many plants, many or most of their cell tissues can give rise to another generation. And so, your average sort of leafy tree, let's say, any branch can push out a flower at the end of that, and so the tip of any branch could become a germ cell line. And there are some plants, that are, really almost any part of them, like cycads and things like that. They can push out that kind of stuff from almost anywhere. And And so it's very, very fascinating. So they organize themselves differently, and the evolutionary pressures on them, that mold their development are different, are very, very different. You cut off my arm, and you've cut off my ability to be behaviorally plastic on some level.
Right.
If you cut off a plant's limb, it's different. You might temporarily disable it from producing food if there was a lot of photosynthesis happening there, and it has to heal its wound just like we do, but you've actually not removed any base abilities from the plant. All of its cells have the ability to differentiate in different ways so that they can express all of the metabolic possibilities in that organism. Once I cut off my arm, I can't regrow another arm.
That's really fascinating. I can't remember the economist that said it, but he said there's no solutions, only trade-offs, and that's really interesting. Like genetically speaking, the trade-offs of a plant in order to be behaviorally less plastic, but then almost in a ecological way more stable.
Well,
right?
there's no. I don't know that we have a good answer to this question, but you want to ask yourself. So we talked earlier in our conversation that plants are the dominant life form by mass,
biomass,
right? Just raw biomass on the planet. They're not the most diverse, right? There's probably between 400,000 and 500,000 species of plants. There are way more species of insects. There may be millions of species of fungi. Bacteria and viruses are even hard to think about species. And so they're not the most diverse from our species concept necessarily, but they're out there, and they have the most genes, so that they may have the most chemical diversity or metabolic diversity. And so it's hard to test these things, right? But there seems to be some ability that plants have to fill niche space throughout the biosphere more successfully than really any other species.
That's fascinating. I sometimes will read about Alexander von Humboldt. He's like one of my perennial going back to. And him going through the Andes and kind of having the idea of, I think it was like ecological niches maybe, or whichever one of his novel ideas, but essentially he was traveling along the same altitude in the Andes, and he realized that all of the plant species that was in one band of it, even though it may have been covered by several distances and changes in variation of elevation, but all of a sudden the same species, or a very similar one, maybe one that was like one branch off of it, but in the same organism was kind of there, and that's really interesting. Like the way that you put it, it's almost like the plants kind of get a foothold and they can just take over.
Well, that's an interesting thing is that like what we would now call an ecotone, right? And he definitely was one of the people who really first theorized those things and saw these great patterns in plant biogeography that helped him out. So you see these. You can go all over the world and see what are similar habitats, similar systems, right? So whether you're in an alpine environment in the Andes or you're in an alpine environment in the Alps, the challenges, the nature of that climate in that particular place are very, very similar. And so the plants in those two places evolve very similar responses to deal with that, and oftentimes it's very different plant groups that come up with the same sort of a solution, and we call that convergent evolution. And of course that happens in other organisms as well, but in plants it's because plants are in all these niche spaces and they're moving, there's so many really wonderful examples. And so one of my favorite examples would be cacti and succulents, right? So true cacti, which are only in the family Cactaceae, are only found with one exception in North and South and Central and South America. They're a completely new world area. And you go, kidding me? There's deserts in Africa and Asia and everywhere else, and they have cacti, and they don't have any cacti. They have succulents. There are a variety of other families, the Euphorbia family and the Portulaca family that have evolved the same things that we associate with cacti: big, thick, water-holding stems, reduced or no leaves, photosynthetic stems, some kind of armoring, to protect them. A lot of time the armoring is actually there not so much for physical protection against herbivores, but to create air boundary layers that decrease the amount of evapotranspiration, in these arid environments. Metabolically, the plants have evolved these alternate forms of photosynthesis, we call CAM photosynthesis, crassulacean acid metabolism photosynthesis, which is named for another plant family, the Crassula family. They evolved that independently all over the planet to deal with these conditions of very high aridity, where they need to use each water molecule much more efficiently, even if it has, and they have trade-offs. There's cost to that. So we grow slower, but we're more efficient with each molecule of water that we're processing through us. And so because there is this interesting fact of what you would call geography and geology, that the base conditions, the water availability, nutrient availability, atmospheric conditions, all that kind of stuff, are similar in discrete pockets that don't communicate with each other across the globe. Plants make this wonderful natural laboratory to see how a very chemically diverse life form that's using the evolution of chemical diversity leading to morphological and other adaptive features, how that happens, and how that there are trajectories that are repeated all over the place as a result of similar environmental pressures.
Yeah. The geographic pressures that put on both human culture and species evolution just is a wellspring of just
and humans are different, right? So humans have evolved a way of being able to thrive despite great geographic challenges. So we, you and I, who were both born in Midwest northern climates, we can be here in Southern California, a completely different place than we we don't see any rain for 8 to 10 months out of the year.
Yeah.
Which is weird, right? But that doesn't impact our ability to survive. Or I should say, it does impact it, but we can come up with solutions to it. You cannot take some of my favorite plant species, white birch or gray birch, or and bring them from those climates and put them here. It's just they won't do it. Even if you baby them, even if you give them everything you think they want, they're just not going to do it. And it's a different form of humans. We could argue: do humans have a niche? Do we construct our niche wherever we go? And we're not the only organisms that do that. There are these great cosmopolitan species, the rats, certain rats, certain
Coyotes.
insects, coyotes, insects. But the question is, are we all exploiting niches? Are we altering the niches? Are we creating something? I think human beings are interesting because I think you can make an all of the above argument. Human beings are capable of thriving by exploiting new niches. We're capable of altering a niche to what we want it to be. And we're certainly capable of adapting plastically to whatever life throws at us. We're not dissimilar from rats. We find ways to survive, even under very, very tough conditions.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And part of my fascination with the Anthropocene is the fact that we are going through such a drastic shift, and some of these geographic zones that we were just saying, and geologic zones are definitely shifting. Some of them are shifting both because of human direct contact, and other ones are shifting because of just the shifting climatic zones that are happening, and kind of the bands and shifting, more northernly, if in altitude or even in latitude. Right. And what we do to adapt that, I find pretty interesting.
Well, it's really interesting. I mentioned earlier I'm an optimist. And I think in these days, you kind of have to both be simultaneously an extreme optimist and extreme pessimist. One cannot deny the fact that climate change is having a potentially existential, catastrophic effect. Now, you always have to qualify that, existential and catastrophic to who? To whom? To talking to humans, to all humans, to certain socioeconomic strata, to certainly to many, many organisms out there in the world. We're looking at a minimum of 20 to 30% extinction potentially within 100 or 200 years. These are levels of extinction that we have not seen since giant asteroids hit the Earth and wiped out the dinosaurs and things like that. So that's huge. That's a huge impact. But at the same time, I believe that human beings can find a way to steward resources better. And, for the first time in human history, at least, we have the ability to recognize all the stuff that's out there. And even the stuff that we can't save where it is, we can save representatives of it, or at least learn about them, and make sure that information or that species is not lost completely. And we I think, have the capacity and potential to grow into a society and a superorganism ourselves that can steward that stuff wisely. And I think, you have to be somewhat ideologically plastic. Let's use that theme. I think, too often human beings are very, for whatever reason, we are very obsessed with internal logical consistency. And while I appreciate that, and everyone likes that, I think it has something to do with predictability. We like it when things are predictable, and when systems are internally consistent, they're predictable. But there's no real reason why things should be, or even better, if they're internally consistent. And so for some reason, a human being wants to hear another human being say, either I believe we're going to hell or we're going to heaven, right? And the complex reality is often harder to kind of fit into that. And so I think that we can both have an intrinsic understanding of the value of nature, and we can say, I appreciate that plant and that tree and that insect and that lizard and everything else out there for itself. And I can have a concept that says, I'm not the center of the world, our species is not the center of the world, and we should steward things in such a way that we try to understand that we shouldn't be as hubristic. But I think at the exact same time, we can also say there has been no power on Earth, at least without evoking, religion and supernatural, with as much power as human beings, at least conscious power that as human beings have right now, and so we are, in fact, as gods, and whether or not you find that to be an offensive concept or not has nothing to do with science, right? I mean, Catholics are very comfortable with that because the Catholic Church feels that that's very consistent with the mythology, with our stories of the Garden of Eden and God giving humans dominion and stewardship over the all of the everything on the earth, right? So we're kind of comfortable with that idea. Whereas there are other religions and philosophies that say no, that we're not comfortable with that at all. We view the earth quite differently. It's not ours. It's it belongs to somebody else or something else. And I think that there's going to be a plurality of those thoughts. I mean, we're not going to subject somehow everybody into the same way of thinking about these things. So you have to be able to kind of operate in all these areas, and it's going to be very hard indeed to get everybody onto the same page if we insist on some kind of intellectual, dogmatic purity for the reasons why we're willing to steward and safeguard nature. So I almost don't. I don't care. I'm thrilled if somebody comes to me and says that through a deep exploration of my spirituality, I have come to realize that we should care better for our plants. Or someone else who says, I'm a hunter, and all I really care about is hunting deer and pheasant or something like that. But I recognize that those things that I love hunting won't be around for me to teach my kids how to hunt them if we don't steward all the things that they need, right? In fact, that mentality, most of our great conservation organizations have come out of hunters.
Yeah.
And so that's not a trivial thing that I'm saying. It's
and
very,
it's also
very
a very controversial thing that I think most people aren't aware of, is the fact that a lot of conservation is supported through hunting.
I think it's one of those things that's very controversial amongst a certain segment of population and completely uncontroversial amongst another one. And I think one of the big things that we don't talk about enough is simply the human demographic element in how how these things are influenced, how our conceptions of what's good or bad is influenced. And so I'm sort of obsessed with the fact that you talk about all these rapid changes, right? To me, the biggest rapid change in humanity is simply the number of people that we've added in the last 200 years, on this geometric growth curve, and the way that demographic shift has shifted the occupations and daily lives of human beings. So if you go back 200 years, if you go back to 1800, and just looking at the United States, not only do we have way fewer people, orders of magnitude fewer people, but 90% of people were farmers. And like when I say farmers, I don't mean food prep. I don't mean everywhere along the food chain. I mean actual farmers. That's what they were doing. They were farming in the field. And here we are 200 years later, and less than 2% of Americans are farmers, and probably only a quarter of that, about a half of a percentage, are what we would call economic farmers, people who derive their primary income from farming. And everyone else is doing something else. And so we have... And that's the primary thing that has allowed the proliferation of the urban environment, right? So you go back to I think 50% of the U.S. population became urbanized by something. It was just before World War II. It wasn't that long ago, right? And now we're at 80% in the United States and almost 70% worldwide, right? These massive demographic shifts of not only how many of us there are, but where we are. And I think that if you grow up urban, you don't hunt. And it's
Right.
very easy to kind of dismiss hunting and say that that's not a necessary thing and there's no knowledge to be gained from hunting. If you grow up in a hunting environment, I can tell you from interacting with people that people who know the local botany and the local insects are almost always the hunters, better than anybody else. And they're out there observing nature, and so I think a lot of it has to do with how we have new stratifications for where we live and what we do in those places that we live in. That's I think also driving a lot of our political differences and things like that.
100%, yeah.
But we don't think about it all that much just in terms of raw, what does this stuff mean? And I had this great conversation. So some years ago, I was asked to, because we haven't talked about this much, but I do a lot of writing and I do a lot of work on how public botanic gardens, especially in urban and suburban centers,
I've been enjoying this so much I haven't got any of my questions
Oh,
on that.
that's
But
okay.
no, keep going.
Can really help solve this issue, right? These rural-urban interface issues, and one of the big ones is around agriculture, right? So how do we help urban people understand how agriculture functions? Just without being dogmatic about it, just what is agriculture? And I've been doing a lot of writing about that and thinking about it over the years and instituting very large exhibits and things like that help people understand agriculture. And so I was asked by actually a small biotech ag company here in San Diego if I would speak to a group of Canadian farmers that was coming down from Canada to learn about they happened to have a canola-based technology for Canadians. So I said, sure, because I love, anytime someone asks me to speak to farmers, I'm pretty happy about it, especially rural farmers, because it's they're hard to find rural farmers. I mean, they're rural. So if someone brings a bunch of rural farmers here into the city and says, it's like, yes, I'd like to go talk to them. So I went and I gave this talk about how, I think it's very important in botanic gardens to teach about plant breeding and about these things that everyone finds interesting. Like, people are blown away when you tell them that broccoli and cauliflower and cabbage and, kohlrabi are all the same plant species that's been adapted by centuries of breeding by human populations into all these cool morphologies and vegetables, right? So just basic stuff like that. So I gave a talk like that, nothing controversial. And it was great, and the farmers were just like, oh, it's so cool, we love it. Because the farmers love what they do. Agree or disagree with how they do it. They have pride in what they do. And this one farmer was very I could see he was very consternated after the talk, and he came up to me afterwards, and he was quiet, kind of stereotypical what you would expect from a Canadian Plains farmer, from Saskatchewan, growing I don't know how many acres, but probably about 30 or 40,000 acres of canola, and rotating it with, whatever he's rotating it with. And he said to me, I appreciate everything you're talking about, and it's really helpful. He goes, but I don't know how we're going to solve this problem. He goes, it's not just what you've talked about. And he starts talking about how his own daughter has so rejected the way in which he does agriculture. Because by every way you would shake it, he's what somebody would call a conventional factory farmer. He's got big tractors and big monocrop lands and all that kind of stuff. And his daughter has gone so far as to say that she's ashamed and that she thinks that family business is evil, and we had a really interesting conversation. He feels that he understands where she's coming from, why she would say that, but he also thinks that if you look further into the issue, you realize that very intensive farming is actually one of the important pathways to sustainability, because it means you don't have to farm everywhere. It means there are lands that you can keep out of farming, and there are some other benefits. But it's a complicated thing. But his real problem was not that she felt that anything they did might be wrong. He felt that it was great if younger generations see problems in what we're doing and try to develop ways to fix them and improve them. But more that it was conceived of in a very black and white, evil and good and evil sense. And that kind of floored me. I didn't really have. I didn't know what to say. All I could say, I sort of put on my educator hat, and all I said was, look, all we can do is provide people with good information. But if you're trying to convince them to have different values than they have now, you're in the world of propaganda and dogma, and no longer in the world of what we typically think of as education in a democratic society. And so there's a big conundrum there. There's a big tension, and it's interesting. It's very interesting.
Yeah, I lean very heavily on the Stoics and philosophy in that sense, and I really agree a lot with Socrates' wisdom is the solution to everything, and the only way to get wisdom is through curiosity. And that's part of why I'm doing this. And I think that the what you could do in the Botanic Gardens is spark curiosity.
Right.
Like, when I was thinking about this interview, I always like to reflect back on my life because it's always easier to get yourself in a space of curiosity, I suppose, now that I'm saying it. If you try to reflect on your own life experiences. And one of my younger memories was going to the Chicago Botanic Gardens conference that was in Navy Pier, and it was like in the atrium there, and it was just awe-inspiring how many different species of flowers. The flowers were what got me, and I was like, and I didn't know at the time, but now reflecting back, I'm colorblind, right? I'm red and green colorblind.
Oh, wow.
So going somewhere and seeing all these vivid colors in plants, you know, in my adult eyes looking back, was probably the first time that I was able to see plants that to me looked so vivid, right? Because like growing up in the Midwest, like not everybody would plant really, you know, bright tulips or whatever, right? Like it's not something that someone would invest in spending money to do every year, right?
Right.
So going there, like really just kind of blew my mind as to what the variety of everything is and all of that. But I really think the only way out is curiosity. I mean, I think you have to have that. And I think of a lot of what I appreciate of what you're doing here and a lot of what I was reading and coming up to this is trying to do that, trying to use, like, there's this pinwheel here I have of using botanic gardens. I think this is from one of your infographics, actually.
Yeah.
Of research, horticulture, recreation, education, and outreach, and having botanic gardens in the center of that. I think that that's really great. And, I mean, just to go back to that conversation, that's really interesting. Some of the things you said that So I lived with my grandparents in a small town in Illinois called Morris, and we lived in this like century-old farmhouse and it's surrounded by cornfields. And at the time, it was so awe-inspiring because it's just like, oh my God, this is so like I can't imagine how amazing and difficult it was to make these lines so straight and to like, you know, it all just looks like corn. There's nothing else there. You know what I mean? It really kind of blew my mind. And now I'm in this strange place of trying to sort out my feelings on it because I understand, like, I've consulted in the industry. I understand what agriculture is and big factory farming agriculture, and I understand, like, you know, Borlaug and his great, you know, leaps forward in humanity, and I've read this as well in some of your publications of, I don't remember exactly the percentages, you'll probably correct me, of how much our population has grown, but we've only needed, 3% more land or some small percentage?
In most, I think we have, estimates are that we reached peak farmland maybe somewhere between 10 and 30 years ago.
Right.
So we appear to be maintaining, it's different for each crop and different region of the world, but we have, especially since World War II, we have been on a very fast track of crop yield improvement. And that has stayed above, the slope of that improvement line has stayed above the slope of the human population increase line. So a big part of why we have not had the mass starvation that was predicted that we would have in the 40s and 50s, and Borlaug, who you mentioned, he won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1970 as an agricultural scientist, really for saying to the elites in countries all over the world. And funding organizations all over the world, like, we cannot go quietly into the night on this. We can't let hundreds of millions of people starve, and that he thought that the application of agricultural science would help with that. And when he won the Nobel Prize in 1970, the Nobel Prize Committee estimated that his work, and he was very humble about it and said, it was thousands of people, he just was the figurehead, but the work that's attributed to him and his team saved 1 billion with a B people from starvation, and they had really only started working in the 50s.
Right.
That wasn't like something he did in over the next 500 years, and so there's an argument that he maybe have been the greatest humanitarian of all time when you look at lives sort of saved from preventable death, and starvation is a very terrible way to die. So. Or lack of, starvation is not most people don't die from acute starvation. They die from slowly becoming malnourished and getting horrible diseases, and, it's really awful. So, he proved that, and they did it by a combination of many different technologies. And the way they did breeding, shuttle breeding, the way that they innovated using certain kinds of genetics, and in his case for wheat in particular, dwarfing genes, as well as disease resistance genes, very important stuff. And nobody talks about that stuff now because it's very uncontroversial. But the part of it that...
banal, if you will.
Well, it's fundamental, it's so important.
Yes.
But the part of it that's very controversial, and what gets associated with what he called the Green Revolution, that was his sort of, we were creating a green revolution, farming revolution, so people wouldn't be starving. And a lot of it economically was about people moving from subsistence farming to having enough to sell so that the farmers themselves were not in poverty, even though they were producing food. And it's important to note that Borlaug himself grew up on a very, very poor subsistence farm in Iowa. And so he always talked about the importance of he was motivated to move things forward, and he was able to connect with farmers in other parts of the world because he experienced exactly what they were going through, and his family did. And he said, I always remembered what hunger felt like, to be truly hungry. And it happened, he, during the Depression and things like that, they didn't always have enough food. And anyway,
I know that about him. I've read about him a lot. I didn't know that. That's interesting.
Yeah, there's one of my favorite biographies of his is written by a guy named Noel Vietmeyer. And they knew each other, and Noel Vietmeyer was a writer for the National Academy of Sciences and interviewed Borlaug many, many times during his life, and there's a long 3-volume version and there's a condensed version as well, but he goes through a lot of the early history.
I'm going to check that out.
So anyway, the thing that we talk about a lot with Borlaug is, of course, sort of the part of it that led to monocropping and a lot of chemical fertilizer. And, Borlaug initially was very focused on Mexico. And at the time in Mexico where he was working there, and he was mainly working for, big foundations like the Ford Foundation, Mexico was not food secure. Mexico was importing food from the United States. Now Mexico's a very food secure country. And a lot of it was because they didn't have very good yields on wheat and also corn. But they started with wheat. And one of the, like I said, there was many traits that they were working on, disease resistance, and they were successful with dwarfing genes, all this kind of stuff. But they also selected varieties they created new varieties of wheat that were more responsive to what we would now call agricultural chemicals, and in particular nitrogen fertilizer, which was in great abundance and very cheap because nitrogen fertilizer is essentially TNT. So the great munitions factories of the world that formed between World War I and World War II, after World War II, had really perfected making cheap nitrogen in a form that it turns out it can be exploded, and that's pretty much the same form that plants can use, ammonium. And
wow.
And so that was a very cheap commodity. And so if you were somebody looking to stave off, starvation, you're like, well, I can get this stuff, right? It's a lot of these. That wasn't very deep. The thought process that's like, we can get this in huge quantities, and it turbocharges the crops, but we need the crop varieties that are responsive to it. And so that ushered in an age of breeding plants to be very responsive to this turbocharging, right? And there's been a lot of problems, a lot of pollution and other problems that have resulted in from having all of this fertilizer applied onto fields. Not to mention that nitrogen fertilizer in itself is very highly dependent on the fossil fuel industry because it's pretty much made from natural gas going through what's called the Haber-Bosch process. And that's also very simplified because it's not just nitrogen, it's phosphorus and potassium and other things, and those are mostly mined minerals. Those are not sort of conjured out of air from with fossil fuel energy. But we are surrounded mostly by nitrogen that's inaccessible to us, so it's about getting that into an accessible form. So, but Borlaug is very much kind of sort of remembered for being this person who spurred the agricultural system worldwide into large monocultural farms, heavily dependent on chemical inputs. But ironically, he's also one of the people most responsible for diminishing the amount of chemical inputs on farms for disease control, because he really got disease resistance on a genetic level happening so that you didn't need to use as many fungicides and things like that. So it's very complicated. In addition, Borlaug himself, and at his Nobel Prize acceptance speech, talked about all of the problems that were going to come. He talked about the solutions that they developed as Band-Aids. He's like, look, everyone was going to die. So we've made it so that they didn't die, but we have not solved the other problems of the world.
Wow.
And he was really and nobody listened to him very much on that. And he talked about it. It's really interesting. If you go back to the speech, he if I remember properly, he was mentioning specifically in 1970 commodity prices were low, and he was talking about how whenever commodity prices are low, nobody cares about agriculture. Right? You can't. None of the funders give money. The government, if they care at all, it's about propping up the prices, because the problem is that the farmers are going out of business and having problems because they just can't earn enough money, even if they have bumper crops. Right? And he said people only care about agriculture in the years where the prices are high, and And he said, and everything is wrong, because when the prices are high is actually when the farmers are doing best. But poor people do worse because they can't afford to buy their crop. But people start getting involved in how to do agriculture when prices are high because there's more money to be made, right? But when prices are low, nobody gets involved because then it's only the farmer's welfare who's negatively impacted. And he kind of talked about all these all problems like that, all these mismatches in the signals for when society should be dealing with agriculture and how wrong they were and how they, what we were paying attention to was not the stuff that was going to help. He talked about over-reliance. He talked about on small numbers of crop species. He talked about depleting the world's topsoils, and all of that stuff. But it's interesting how our collective memory has filtered that into, something actually quite different than what it was. And some people say, oh, well, there were unintended consequences. And they go, no, they were not unintended. They were intended and they were understood. And it was, look, either we do these things that we know will be bad or people will die, but we're going to talk about it and say, hey, we can't keep doing them this way. As we get stability, we have to evolve into more enlightened and smarter ways of doing this. And we, depending on who you are, you could argue that we did that quite well. In fact, to have gone from an insecure food system post-World War II, where we were projecting hundreds of millions, if not billions of deaths, to a place where really the only famine that exists today is because of economic or political strife. At that time, you have to remember, there really wasn't enough food to feed everybody. I mean, it wasn't like, oh, if we move the food here or there, it's enough. No, there really was a gap. There was not enough food to feed everybody. Now there is enough food to feed everybody, and where people are starving, it's because of other challenges. But we also have tremendous environmental challenges associated with feeding food, and that's been exacerbated again by population increase. As smart as you can be, in fact, a lot of the solutions we deploy today, if we were deploying them on the same amount of land for the same population as existed in 1960 or 1970, the problems wouldn't be nearly as severe as they are today, just because we wouldn't have to do it on as much land as we have. So anyway, all of this is to say that we tend to co-opt history into the narratives that we're trying to talk about today, and sometimes that's good and sometimes that's bad. But one of the things that we talk about in our chapter that you referenced earlier in the Anthropocene book is that humanity's having a hard time, right? When we try to look at these agricultural problems and get too kind of process-oriented and say, oh, GMOs are bad, or monocrop is bad, agroforestry is good, that's really not helpful because it's not context-dependent. GMOs are good sometimes and bad sometimes. They're just tools, right? Agroforestry works in some places, it doesn't work in other places. Polyculture is great in some places, it doesn't work in other places, right? Another thing that I love talking about is, I kind of stole this from a political scientist named Ron Herring, to paraphrase. He's a Cornell professor. Agriculture is highly heterogeneous in space and time. So you can do the exact same thing in one place, and the different things happen somewhere else, and you can do the exact same thing in the same place in a different year, and different things happen. And it's true. I mean, that's really, really true. And so, it's not quite as it's not to say it's not deterministic, but it's very complicated and stochastic. So, what we propose in the book chapter is that, where we're having the sort of non-expert societal conversations, right, where it's not about a technocratic kind of a decision-making process and conversation, but where it's really societal, democratic decision-making, we would be much smarter if instead of talking about what technologies and what ideologies we think should be utilized to solve agricultural problems, if instead we would focus on what are the goals and frame those goals in an inclusive manner. Right, to encompass the things that we care the most about. So I like to kind of pull back with people when I can. Right, if people are having a big argument about everything has to be organic, or it can't be GMO, or no, everything should be lentils, and lentils the best crop. And some people I love lentils and talk about that very, very publicly. I love lentils too, but it's just I'm not only going to grow lentils everywhere. It's like Soylent Green is the answer, right?
Yeah, right.
It's like, what are you really trying to accomplish, right? And then if somebody's able to pull back and say, well, here's what I want, right? I want to produce enough food. I want the farmers to be able to earn a living and have a nice culture and a nice life. I want enough choice at the consumer level that we can have healthy, nourishing food and that everybody can eat and eat well. I want that to happen on a land mass and a land area that doesn't destroy the environment. I want the chemical inputs to not cause all these problems, and I want the chemical outputs to not cause all these problems. And I go, great. Let us enumerate all of these things, right? There's no substitution for setting what your goals are. And they're going to be complicated on something as big as agriculture, which, as we talked about, is currently consuming a third of the entire landmass of the planet. There's nothing we do as extensively as we do agriculture. I mean, if you think there's problems with mining and petroleum extraction, agriculture is a bigger nut to crack in terms of at least land mass that it's done on. And raw numbers of people too that are involved in it, right? It's still the most common profession in the world, right? That you have to go through the big list. What are the things you want to have happen? And then it doesn't become an ideological battle about what technology is better or worse. It becomes a technocratic conversation about how are those technologies going to be deployed to meet these goals, and recognizing that in one place it's going to be a different mix than in another place. It's a different kind of conversation. Now, most people don't want to have that conversation for some reason. And so then I ask the question of, well, if you don't want to have that conversation, why are you engaged in this conversation to begin with? Do you really care about agriculture and agricultural productivity and the farm workers and everybody else? Or is there some other bigger thing going on in the world, and that you think that the agricultural space is a good place to have that argument? So is this a proxy war for you? Do you really care about, how democratic or capitalist or socialist or progressive or,
insert ideology here,
whatever? Mm-hmm. And you this is the front. This is what that looks like on this front. And my response to something like that is, agriculture is too important to let be subsumed by the ideological crisis du jour. Now, it's always been the case that we've let it be that, because we're humans and that's what happens. But we are getting to these tipping points within the biosphere. We are getting to places where we will, at some point, when it comes, is harder to figure out. But in the next 50 to 75 years, it's likely that some areas of biogeochemical cycling will heavily tilt, and whether it's the nitrogen cycle or the water cycle or the carbon cycle, remains to be seen. Maybe all of the above, right? And that will make things very, very difficult, at least in certain places. So we're getting close to that. So being inefficient in our ability to solve these problems because we're more obsessed with being right about a specific ideology is a very, very, I think, unforgivable form of conceit. Because somebody will pay later. And it's usually not going to be the discussants of that conversation. And my historical analog to this conversation are vaccines, right? So Jenner developed the smallpox vaccine in the very, very late 1700s, right? And we do not have the widespread deployment of vaccines until World War II, right? So you have well over 150 years of availability of life-saving technology, in this case the form of a smallpox vaccine, and then in the intervening years more and more vaccines against communicable disease. You have literally tens to hundreds of millions of deaths that happened in that period of time because society felt that it was not yet ready to embrace the technology. And the same language that was used at the time by the Church of England, by natural philosophers, all these people about the unnaturalness of the smallpox vaccine and subsequent vaccines, which you hear echoed today in the anti-vaccine movement, were strong enough to keep these things societally out of, and people died. I mean, you can go and measure. You can measure the tens, if not hundreds of millions of people who died horrible premature deaths from smallpox and other transmissible diseases when the technology existed that didn't have to happen. So this is not academic, right? And it's not lifestyle. It's not like, oh, okay, they didn't get their cell phones or, whatever, right? I mean, cell phone, I shouldn't minimize because cell phones can be life-saving technology too. But it's very direct, right? Nobody wants a cure for a disease as a cosmetic or a vogue kind of a thing. Food's a little tough because food has a artistic and cultural transmission element to it as well. But I do think that the vaccine debate, the early vaccine debate that started in the time of Jenner and proceeded all the way to World War II and and now has its own new incarnation. I think that is the best historical analogy for a bad way to look at technological debate around agriculture. And there's nothing special about the late 1700s, right? I mean, there was no agricultural revolution in the late 1700s. There was also no chemical revolution. That all kind of came later. So that the vaccine technology itself a little bit predates the Industrial Revolution and a bunch of other things. So it was a true scientific discovery, and I think it's very instructive. It's very important for us to look at events like that, and like you talked about earlier, really think deep and hard about how do we value things. Do we value things based on the needs of today, based on the needs of the past, the norms of the past, the norms of today, and then further pull out and say, okay, all this ideology it's important. Humans have ideology and values, but what's the pragmatic consequence of that? And I think that's where we fall down a lot on the agriculture debate. And it feels to all sides of the debate like people are just constantly moving goalposts, and it's that way because nobody is actually sitting down and saying, here are the goals. Borlaug did a pretty good job of that. Now, people fought him all the time. I mean, if you read his biography, you'll hear that even the very funding agencies that funded him, the people within the funding agency who thought Borlaug's work was worthwhile were constantly fighting off other people within the funding agencies, being like, well, all those hundreds of millions of people are going to die anyway in those countries. Like, why are we got other things we can put this money to. And they weren't bad people. They were like, I think the money is better spent in infectious diseases or in, domestic abuse or, decreasing chances for warfare, things like that. I mean, it's not like they were like, well, let's use the money to go play mini golf. They were reasonable, but it was hard. It was very hard for Borlaug and others to convince people that, and even with success, then people said, so it worked in Mexico, and they said, well, nobody will accept these technologies in India because they might have to accept a slightly different color of, their of naan or their bread, and they said they won't do that. They only will use this kind. And Borlaug said, if they're hungry, I think that they will. Right. And there was a great scientist in India named Swaminathan, Dr. Swaminathan, who's still alive. He won the first ever World Food Prize for his work, and he agreed with Borlaug, and he said, no, our farmers deserve a chance, at least the option about whether or not they want to take on a little bit of technology and change a little bit, and if it's really life and death, they might be willing. And of course, that was overwhelmingly right. It's a very interesting phenomenon to see how these values percolate through the system, and how easy it is for human beings in positions of authority and power, or at least relative comfort, to dismiss the ability of technology to change things for the better, based pretty purely on judgment and ideology. I think a throughput on that I've mentioned a few times in this show is comfort. I think is a great throughput of all, the cultural geography that is Homo sapiens. I think comfort is overwhelmingly one in which you can find a lot of throughput throughout all of them. And I think, to your point about commodity prices, we're comfortable with the price that they're at right now. We don't see the value in going it further, and I think there's some truth to that. And I mean, I think there's a lot of points here that we hit upon there. As actually a pretty big throughput in which, Borlaug said, look, this is what's going to happen, but we need to save the sinking ship. We're going to save this sinking ship, and by doing so, we're going to create more moral and economic and sociological conundrums that are going to come from it, and we're going to need to rise to that occasion, but we get comfortable because of the comfort of his technologies that brought, and now we're kind of learning the lessons that he's taught the hard way, or I think, and everything. Well, again, is timing, right? I think that our memory. I'll give just a little customer service example, right? Okay. So I run a botanic garden, right? We have about 200,000 visitors per year at this botanic garden, and we aim to please our customers. Our customers are the people who come here. It's a visitor experience, but we're a nonprofit that want this visitor experience to also be educational and transformative in the way you talked about seeing flowers and the diversity of flowers in Chicago. That's what we're trying to create, that experience in every young kid. We think every kid should have the opportunity to have that kind of experience that you had, and I had similar experiences as well. But we have customers, so we're very customer service oriented, right? And I know, logically in my brain, I know that I see 100 times, if not more, positive comments about the garden than negative comments. People writing to us all the time on social media, I love visiting the garden. Oh, I brought my kids, it was the best day. Oh, during COVID and this crisis, it's a place of respite and health. And it was just, beaucoup wonderful things to say. We've even done formal surveys, and we can't find somebody who says something negative. Everyone's grateful that for what's happening at this place. But every once in a while, we get a phone call or something that says I'm dissatisfied, and I can tell you I obsess over that. It's almost like the other stuff didn't happen, even though I logically know it's there. Emotionally, I am just fixated on I got to fix that, right? That nobody can have a bad experience here. That's, I don't want that, right? And so I think we all do that, right? I think that, we look back on the history and Borlaug and that whole period of Green Revolution, and and yes, there are all of these things that we're dealing with now that were spurred by that are bad. But if we looked really soberly and you looked at all of the technological innovation that happened and what it enabled and what we still use today, how we spray very, very little fungicide in the United States, in the world, actually, quite frankly, because we are really good at breeding for fungal resistance now, right? Which is a completely benign. There's no environmental impact to solving that as a breeding problem instead of solving it as a chemical input problem. And there's a million examples that are like that, and you could enumerate them all, and you could probably say, and again, very heavy in the pro column is at least a billion people just in the years between 1950 and 1970 were saved from starvation because of these technologies. So, it's just really incorrect to think of this as only negative stuff. Okay, we put on the Band-Aid, but then we never took off the Band-Aid and did physical therapy to get us into a healthy state. Right. That's also an incorrect analogy. It's much, much more complicated than that. We put on the Band-Aid. Parts of the Band-Aid were perfect, and so we still use them. Other parts were not, and we discarded them and moved on. And other parts we did stick with for various reasons, and we still need to deal with them. But for some reason we want to make a morality play out of the whole thing. And I think, at least in the realm of technology adoption, the morality play is a very highly destructive force. And to analogize again, and you said earlier you told me that your wife is involved in nutrition and things like that. I think that actually the most destructive space in the morality play is in human nutrition. And if you look at the way in which people, and human disease, people are blamed for their diseases, right? You get cancer, they lived, it was closer to a factory than somebody else. I mean, everybody wants there to be a reason that's based on a moral understanding for why things happen. So that if somebody has to suffer, they must have kind of done something to deserve that. And if somebody who's fat, it's because they're lazy, not because of some other kind of problem. And somebody who, it's in everything we do. If somebody is, a woman is sexually assaulted and she was asking for it with the way she dressed or something like that. We reduce everything to these really destructive morality plays, and they prevent us from dealing with the real issue. They make it easy for us to say that, we don't have a problem of a male, a sexual abuser. We have a problem of a woman temptress, which is crazy, right?
Yes.
And it's the same. I think it's the same thing in all these areas. We don't have a problem with the way people eat food. We have a problem with that they don't exercise enough, or it's like you don't know that, and there's not. And if you really look at the science, it's not clear. These things that are being said, right? Agriculture is the exact same way. Scientists present this mountain of scientific data that point out to, like, for example, there's all this new research coming out showing that some of the best topsoil creation rates are happening in genetically modified agricultural fields. No, right? There's interesting reasons for why that is. And you go, hey, maybe genetic modification is actually a good thing for soil sustainability. Yeah. And people are just like, you can't even talk about that. Right. Because it doesn't fit, right? And that's such a problem, because that's how the world really works. Some things that we conceive of as evil will be good sometimes and bad other times. And we're constantly, in our desire to moralize all this stuff, pulling ourselves away from possible pragmatic solutions that might work out really well. And just to kind of both sidism, this whole thing, but it's still true, right? I don't want it to come off like I'm anti-moral structure. We started this conversation by talking about how science itself is a shallow epistemology. It does not provide moral understanding. So I think that where the balance is that people need to agree on what's this higher level moral thing, right? Like I think most people agree, no matter other stuff, that we should preserve nature in some way, shape, or form, in a pretty significant way, shape, or form. I love the E.O. Wilson idea of the half Earth. And his idea is sort of a recycled version of Carl Wose's idea. He was about a third Earth, for nature. Carl Rose was a one of the great microbiologists of our time, and or he's dead now, but of the previous generation. And Wilson, same thing, amazing biologist, and he's let's just preserve half the earth, just let's preserve it. These things are great, and I think most people would be like, that's a great idea because of the value. It's about preserving these things that we can all enjoy, and the lungs and the heart and the planet and all that kind of stuff. And then it gets hard because how do you do that, right? Because that we're not doing that right now. And so if every conversation that you're going to have that's going to be tough because some mine is going to have to close and people have a livelihood there and they've built a culture around that place, and if we've decided that this is going to be one of the sanctuaries where we preserve nature, people are going to lose something. Instead of fighting them and being like, you're immoral for still being in the mining business, which most of those people probably had no choice in what they're in, you instead reaffirmed the shared commitment to values and said, remember, we all decided we want to do this. We agree we want to do this. And wow, we're going to have to ask some people to do some really, really hard things. And now you come from a position of empathy. Okay, you who are going to be negatively impacted by this change that we think is required, what can we do to soften that blow? What can we do to preserve your dignity, your way of living, your culture? Whether that's an indigenous group or a guild of professionals or whatever it is, because because things have to change. How do we frame them so that we're not cutting off pragmatic opportunities to fix it, and we're leading with empathy, right? I mean, and I think we haven't learned how to do this yet. We talked earlier in our conversation as well about, all of what we're struggling with in society is a struggle with how to communicate in this complex world. And I think that is one of the great challenges. We've learned a lot. There's a lot of literature on mainly from the fishing literature, shared, that kind of stuff, fishing rights, that's been a big deal. And the EU has been very active in that area where when they've created fishing quotas and, Spanish communities in particular, where a lot of, fishing vessels leave from have been negatively impacted. They've, created opportunities to, retrain and, they've sort of acknowledged that they're taking away livelihoods and that has to be dealt with. Now, it hasn't always worked well. People don't want, in the same way that you think about all the England in the 1970s and 80s, and the prices of when all the coal mining and milling and whatnot were leaving England, and that whole working class was getting hollowed out. That was a horrible thing. That led to all kinds of horrible social strife, and it pushed some people far to the left and some people far to the right.
And we're seeing in the Appalachia now, even. We're
seeing in Appalachia now, and so how do we deal with that? And it bothers me that sometimes you come across environmentalists who are very quick to say, who are very quick to want to control reproductive rights. People shouldn't be allowed to have children anymore. There's just too many of us. And it's like, that's true. There are a lot of us, and it causes problems. But let's think pretty deeply about the idea of, do you still want to live in a democracy? Because cutting off reproductive rights and decision-making, that's a big deal. And I don't know how you could morally justify that, even under an environmental, catastrophe framework, right? And we're quick to do that. It's kind of like, those Appalachian coal miners are getting what they deserve for being Appalachian coal miners,
right?
That's I don't know that that's going to be helpful, and I think in fact it's very negative, and it actually increases the amount of time it takes to finally get on the same page, tribalism is a terrible and horrible thing, and we need to find a way to rise above it. But equally, I feel that way about sciences. I am very annoyed by scientists who, when somebody gives a values-based reason for doing something, says the science doesn't agree with you. So if somebody says, I'm, anti-abortion, that is fundamentally a non-scientific conversation, right? And you can engage in it. Here's a bunch of reasons why, why somebody might be pro-choice, but you're not going to say, well, science conclusively says that human beings should be,
X, Y, and Z.
Yep. Because science doesn't tell you about the value system. And I think a lot of, and unfortunately, there are some, scientists in the public, sphere who use their status as scientists to try to push moral moral things that are couched as science. I have no problems with scientists getting up there as individuals and saying, hey, I morally believe X, Y, and Z. And there's some great examples of that. I think Francis Collins, who's the leader of the National Institute of Health, and he's a great geneticist who happens to also be a devout Catholic, is a great exemplar. Where he's really advancing the best possible science, and also talks very personally about his faith and how he reconciles things that don't always match in a way that's it's neither preachy on the religious side, nor is it say, oh well, the scientific stuff takes precedence, and where my religious values disagree with science, I always go with science. He doesn't say that either, right? So we need more people who are really good at doing that. And here in San Diego, at Scripps, Ram, the great climate scientist there, he's another one who's like that. He's a devout Hindu, and he's really interested in going and talking to communities of faith about climate science.
Wow,
but
I'm not familiar with him. I'll have to...
I'll turn you on to him. He's great,
Thank
and he's an award-winning climate scientist, and he recognizes, I think, as a person who comes from a very strong community of faith, that, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but my understanding is that people do not get their moral understandings of the world from science. Mm-hmm. They get it from their communities, and many of those communities are organized around tradition and religion. And you need to go into those communities and talk to them on those terms if you really want to dialogue.
I fancy myself a bit of a classicist, and I think some of the best things that I have gotten from the classic world is the fact that human beings are narrative storytelling individuals. And I think if you look at the great individuals and really truly extraordinary individuals of our species, they were almost always great storytellers or had people around them that were, right? Because I think that we understand things when you can kind of come into that space of consciousness where I'm allowing you to think for me, and I'm allowing you to have elicit an emotional response within me. And I think a lot of the tribalism we get now is, in a sense, almost a hacking of that, right? I think tribalism is... if I had to say what my personal ideology is, I think I have to steal from Bruce Lee, and the fact that I say that I have an ideology of no ideology, right? I want to steal from the best of everything and find a way to create that into my own story so that I understand it, right? Which is an intensely individual, study, which is incredibly alone almost in a sense. But through that, you're able to find like-minded individuals and build your own type of moral compass, which then you get use as your framework from the outside of the world. And just like these individuals you're saying, where, well, how can you be two things that exist in contradiction to each other? And I have to quote Walt Whitman and say, oh, you say that I disagree with myself. Well, that's okay. I exist in multitudes,
that's
right? And if you ask me what my definition of truth is, I'd have to say it either doesn't exist or it exists only in the space you allow it to exist in incongruency with multiple contradicting aspects. Because all things are all things. An incentive over here is a dissentive over here. And I think a lot of what I really like that you've been saying through this is, we have an incredible challenge ahead of us. And the tipping point is coming. When it's coming, where it's coming from, we don't know. But the best thing that we could do is prepare, be open-minded, and really try to ask as many questions of why as possible. And
I also think to steel ourselves against the tendency, if we are going to go into a very challenging moment in human history, which I think we are, many fibers of our being will, not without reason, be telling us to more narrowly look at our own welfare and our immediate community, our family, and those closest to us. Right? We will cease to be as good citizens of larger jurisdictions, whether that's the state, the nation, the hemisphere, or the world. And I think we need to resist that. And I don't say that in an ideological way. I say that in a very pragmatic way. Looking at the times in history where people have allowed their concerns to become parochial has allowed a lot of other suffering to happen, right? And we don't want to be accused of that, right? Mm-hmm. I don't want to be accused by history of being part of a society of people that didn't let smallpox people be vaccinated against smallpox and have had better lives. Mm-hmm. Somebody bears the responsibility. In fact, large groups of people bear the responsibility of not leveraging available technologies that would have made people's lives better, at that time. And here we have this multitude of technologies, and we constantly deal with the challenges of, well, I can't make that technology available because it doesn't meet economic criteria.
Right.
It's not possible to do profitably. Or I won't ideologically accept that technology, or it's not my problem, so I don't care about that technology. The people who have this problem are a different tribe than mine, right? We have all these reasons and rationale for not using the tools, and sometimes I wish we didn't have the word technology. I wish we would just say tool. They're just
I agree
tools.
with that. Yep.
I'm surprised I haven't said this in our conversation yet. But one of the first things I try to say whenever people want to talk about GMOs all the time. That's like people's favorite topic, and first of all, I always say I'm not pro or anti-GMO. It's a tool, and it may or may not be the right tool depending on what you're trying to do. And the analogy there, and I apologize for all this reasoning by analogy, but it is useful.
Back to my storytelling thing. I think it's useful. I think it's useful. Go ahead.
Is that it's a tool. It's a hammer, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what can I do with a hammer? I can build somebody a house. No more noble task than that. I can knock their head in and take all their stuff. No more evil task than that. The hammer doesn't force me to do any of those things. The hammer doesn't cut off the options to do good or to do evil. There will always be tools, and so the decision making should not be in this space of putting the tools into boxes, on some series of Venn diagrams of are they a good tool or are they a bad tool? It should always be on, is this the right tool for this job? And if we were in that space, where again, back to what I was saying earlier about deciding on what the goals are, you can't even discuss what wrench you need if you don't know what size bolt you have, right? So what is the problem that we're trying to solve? And then agreeing on what the problem is, what's the overarching moral philosophy of why that's a problem that's worthy of solving, and using that moral philosophy to right-size the level of effort and to prioritize. Are people dying? Are they suffering? That's a higher order thing. Is it about comfort? Is it about, and not to say you deprioritize, but understand where those things are, relative to one another. And then you attack it, and you attack it as a problem. Okay, we need to solve this. Here are the goals of solving it. Here's the things we can do and we can't do, and here's the reasons for those things. And okay, here's the giant box of tools we have to leverage on this problem. Let's go to work. And also to be really humble and say, we don't know necessarily which tools are going to be the best. And so we might want to adopt a practice of selectively trying some of the different tools in different contexts and gathering more information about which of those tools is really wonderful. And to further complicate things, recognizing that the tools themselves are not static. We're constantly evolving the toolbox and the tools themselves so that it's
being evolved by the tools.
Exactly. It's a deeply iterative process. And to me, the biggest sin when there are problems is the sin of inaction. Right? Because inaction is the only thing that leads to no new information. So I would almost always rather make an honest, well-intentioned mistake and a false step going in one direction and be open enough and realize that was the wrong thing to do. Right? And then I can change. But if I paralyze myself with inaction, I can't decide what to do, then it's worse. When inertia is lost, it's hard to regain. But inertia in the wrong direction can much more easily be turned into the right direction. And so the habit that we have of confronting complexity and coming to a standstill, coming to the crossroads and stopping, rather than trying, and I don't mean committing to a direction, but keeping moving, to me is one of the gross sins, because we know that the challenges that we're confronting are so severe and so big that we don't have a whole lot of time to sit around. We know that. And yet we often choose and we often argue towards ideological responses that are basically just gum up the works and mean we're not going to do anything, or whatever we will do will be highly diluted and pushed very far off in time. We like to kick the can. And I think kicking the can is really the worst possible thing that can be done.
Yeah, I think that's a great place to stop. That the biggest sin is inaction. I couldn't agree with that more. I mean, I think the conundrums. I obviously take a bit of a penchant in just for my work in the technological space, and what I mean by that is like raw communications tech and like physical computing, and now this physical biological divide that we're getting that's starting to get a little bit more muddy. Being in somebody that's in emerging technologies, that's a lot of what I work on. But I think in that space and in all spaces is I really agree with that. We're facing something big by our own invention and from things that have come before us, and the only thing we can do is just try to iterate and try to get better at it.
There's really no choice. I mean, it's funny how we talk about, the fact that we have to respond to unintended consequences of the past as sort of a negative thing. I don't know that there's another option.
There isn't. There's never been.
There's never been.
Right.
So I'm not sure why it's sort of a completely inadmissible point. I mean, if you feel that way, it means you really think that there's at some moment going to be some sort of divine intervention that fixes things, or you believe that society really is working towards some sort of a stable, non-dynamic place. That we can return to Eden in this kind of very boring, static way,
or a complete nihilistic perspective.
Well, that nihilism has no place in any conversation.
Yeah, no, but it's abound today, right?
There was only one. Well, I think that misanthropy is okay.
Okay.
I think that and I say that almost entirely because of how much respect I have for Mark Twain.
Oh, I love Mark Twain.
Yes. And I think that he channeled his and he really was a misanthrope.
Yeah, definitely.
But he channeled it into biting sarcastic humor.
Yep.
And a critique of society in a way that was ultimately helpful.
Well, thank you very much for talking. I appreciate it. And we didn't get to many of my questions, but hopefully we'll be able to talk again soon. This was wonderful. Thank you again for your time.
Likewise,
and
thank you.
Yeah, this is a wonderful setting.